Where do I grab?
Okay, we are now recording, so I'm just gonna announce the title and topic for today. We are really lucky to have this Terra talk with Dr. Chip Fletcher, titled "The Past is No Longer an Accurate Guide to the Future," diving into the topics of climate science and climate impacts, and going all the way to climate mitigation and sequestration. So it's going to be a wonderful talk, a grand tour of a lot of the key themes of the course, and yeah, we have a lot to cover today. So I am going to go ahead. Can you all still hear me? I'm frozen.
I can hear you.
You can hear me? Okay, great. Sorry, I think as my computer expanded to the view screen mode, I froze myself. But yeah, so I'm going to start off with an introduction of our guest speaker. And yeah, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Chip Fletcher. He has given a guest talk. Oh, if you're joining, please keep yourself muted so we can, yeah, thank you. He has given a guest talk in each of the Terra cohorts of this core course so far, which is just an amazing track record and amazing generosity to join us time and time again to share his knowledge and experience on climate science and just motivate more of us getting into our climate action journeys to ground ourselves in the science and learn from it and just act with urgency and passion. So Dr. Chip Fletcher is the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs and a professor in the Department of Earth Sciences at the School of Ocean and Earth Science and Technology at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. And he is also the vice chair of the Honolulu Climate Change Commission. Chip teaches graduate and undergrad courses emphasizing earth science, climate change, coastal community resiliency, paleoclimatology, and sedimentology. And he's been a principal advisor in funding and awarding over 30 graduate research degrees and has received a number of teaching, research, and community service awards. And what I really appreciate is that Chip's work is really outwardly focused to a broad audience, including policymakers, including citizens. He has done a lot of research into sea level rise and local impacts in Hawaii of climate change. So we're just really lucky to have him here, and I'm gonna stop there and let Chip take it from there.
Thanks, Lainey. Are you looking at just my single PowerPoint screen there?
We're looking at your presenter view. I can see all the slides at the bottom, and yeah, I think it needs to.
How's that?
Yeah, there we go. Perfect.
So as you can see, I've changed the title of the talk, which I do often. I want to call this "Climate Change has Created a Planetary Emergency." And I want to welcome everybody this morning. Let's dive right in. I'm going to do a very broad overview with lots and lots of little details and cover a lot of ground here. So I know you've already had the basics, but I like to remind ourselves of certain aspects of the greenhouse effect and how it is leading to global warming and climate change. As you know, sunlight comes in, and where we have a high albedo or a bright surface, it can be reflected back out to space. We know that the Arctic region is warming more than twice as fast as the rest of the planet and losing albedo. Albedo is dropping down from 0.8, 0.9 down to 0.5 or 0.4 as snow and ice cover retreats, especially the sea ice on the Arctic Ocean. But where sunlight does intersect the dark surface, it will warm that surface, which will release heat, infrared radiation that can be trapped by a number of gases in the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide is the one that we worry about most because it has the longest residence time. Those gases will re-radiate that infrared radiation, and some of that re-radiation goes back down and heats Earth's surface a second time. The more greenhouse gas you have, the warmer the effect is, and the more that you warm the air, the greater the humidity is. And humidity or water vapor is actually the most powerful greenhouse gas, although it has a very, very short residence time in the atmosphere. But this is to introduce a fundamental concept in climate science known as feedback effects. Here, for every degree of warming you get from carbon dioxide and the other types of greenhouse gases, the increase in atmospheric water vapor gives you an amplifying feedback effect of an additional degree, 1 additional degree. So where are these greenhouse gas emissions coming from? They continue to increase. China is the world's largest emitter, but cumulatively over recent history, the US is the largest emitter with about 25% of the greenhouse gases that have been added to the atmosphere so far. The poorest countries emit less than 1%, but tend to suffer the greatest impacts. And under current stated policies, even here in 2020, during the pandemic, expected warming is trending towards over 3 degrees Celsius. So despite last year's decline, 2019 over 2018, coal is still the single largest source of power generation, accounting for over 36% of global power. And that compares with just 10% provided by renewable energy. And this was stated by the CEO of British Petroleum in their annual statistical review of world energy. So as emissions enter the atmosphere, they go through various stages of storage. The sources of anthropogenic emissions include burning of fossil fuels for manufacturing, for transportation, but we also have a significant source of both methane and carbon dioxide from land use. And by land use, I want to include agriculture and poor soil husbandry, which can result in the release of carbon dioxide from our agricultural fields, whereas they have a tremendous potential to actually store carbon if we would do more appropriate regenerative types of agriculture. Once we release CO2 into the atmosphere, about 44% will go into the atmosphere, stay there for long duration, slowly dissipating through storage in various sources. But we know that some CO2 that we release today will still be there over 1,000 years from now, essentially doing permanent warming from a human time frame. About 29 or 30% of the emissions are taken up in that same year through photosynthesis, and about 23% gets dissolved in the ocean, creating ocean acidification. So H2O plus CO2 makes H2CO3, which is an acid, carbonic acid. Carbonic acid reacts with calcium carbonate, CaCO3, and calcium carbonate is what many plankton secrete for their exoskeletons. It's what corals and other types of tropical reef organisms secrete. And it's what reefs themselves are made of, is calcium carbonate, a mineral called aragonite or calcite. And although the level of ocean acidification is not at the point where it's dissolving these secretions yet, it is affecting the ability of these organisms to secrete the necessary mineralizations that they need for their metabolism. We are experiencing accelerated warming. If you see here, this long blue line is a trend in warming from Jim Hansen, former chief scientist at NASA. This blue line shows that warming since 1970, it's basically stayed on the same rate of acceleration. But in the last 5 years, we see warming lifting off of this trend. The departure from this trend cannot be explained by natural variability. And it indicates that today's warming since the pre-industrial time of about 1.2 degrees Celsius is accelerating. The World Meteorological Organization has concluded that there is a 1 in 5 chance, a 20% chance that sometime in the next 4 years, one of those years will reach a global annual average temperature of 1.5 degrees, which is the first United Nations target from the Paris Agreement in 2015. 2020, this year, is trending for the hottest year on record, despite the fact that we have a mild La Nina going on, which typically produces cool years. And so it's very interesting now that we are producing potentially record-setting years without the assistance of El Nino, which is a process in the Pacific Ocean that releases heat from the ocean into the atmosphere. Instead, we have a La Nina taking place, which actually is a process that removes heat from the atmosphere and stores it in the ocean temporarily. To have that process occur while we are reaching a global record temperature for the year is simply amazing. And it speaks to the liftoff that we see here, the acceleration that we see. So what are the impacts of climate change? There are numerous impacts. One is that we are melting the world's ice centers. Greenland melting has now quadrupled since 2010, and a report came out this past August that Greenland ice discharge into the ocean is far surpassing snow accumulation every year. The whole ice sheet is in a constant state of loss. Even if climate change stopped, the ice sheet would still be losing mass. And modeling indicates that we will lose the entire Greenland ice sheet within 1,000 years. The Antarctic ice sheet melting has tripled since 2010. West Antarctic glaciers are in irreversible decline, this very dark area. There's a set of outlet glaciers there in West Antarctica that are held back by floating ice shelves, the Pine Island Glacier and the Thwaites Glacier, together constituting about 1.3 to 1.4 meters of sea level rise alone, just from the amount of ice there. And a paper came out this summer. Well, actually, we had a pair of papers in 2014 which said that these glaciers, Pine Island and Thwaites, have begun irreversible decline. And then this summer we had a paper that stated the natural buffer system preventing Pine Island and Thwaites glaciers from flowing rapidly is breaking down. The ice shelves are showing new damage areas that are the first signs of structural weakening and that precondition these ice shelves for disintegration. And what the paper is referring to is one of these enhancements over here where you see the shearing, the tensional forces simply pulling away the moving ice sheet from the stable ice. And the conclusion is that we're seeing an acceleration and potential destabilization of these ice sheets. We had not expected to see this until the second half of the century. And this raises the incredible specter of multi-meter sea level rise this century. We should not conclude that yet, but we certainly need to put that on our awareness. Sea level, global sea level is monitored by a set of satellite missions from the European Space Agency and from the US Space Agency. Currently, global sea level is rising at about 3.5 millimeters per year, measured over the last 28 years. But if you just look at the last 10 years, global sea level is now rising at a millimeter higher, 4.6 millimeters per year, or 1.5 feet per century. Another impact of climate change is that global weather disasters have tripled in the past 2 decades. Global extreme rainfall has increased 12%. And at current emissions, 70% of world population and economic activity face a 500% increase in flood impact. In the US, we see the acceleration of the occurrence every year, a rising occurrence of billion-dollar weather and climate disasters. We see an increase in severe storms, an increase in flooding, and even an increase in severe freezes, which lead to all sorts of damage, including crop loss. Freezes are occurring because the jet stream is destabilized because of the rapid warming of the Arctic, known as Arctic amplification. One of the drivers, in fact, the primary driver of atmospheric circulation is the temperature difference between the tropics and the Arctic and the Antarctic. And as the Arctic warms more than twice as fast as the average of the rest of the planet, that temperature difference decreases, atmospheric circulation slows down, and the jet stream, the northern hemisphere jet stream, slows down and develops large waves, large meanders. And a southern dip in a jet stream meander will pull down Arctic air, and we'll get record-setting snowfall and deep freezes occurring. The occurrence of these cold record-setting events is a result of global warming. And that's a potentially confusing topic, but it's also convenient for politicians and other leaders who discount the science of climate change and are looking for reason to convince their constituency of the same misinformed opinions. The Western US fire season is almost half a year longer than it was 40 years ago. The number of large fires has tripled, and in fact, firefighters in the US now say that there's really no longer a season for wildfires. It's a rolling series of events that takes place all year long. And extremely importantly for human society is modeling that shows large areas of the planet at or above 3 degrees C of warming, our current pathway, our current trajectory, will become too hot for humans. So this paper came out in Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. If you look at the map, you can see a couple of black splotches. Those black areas represent 1% of the land surface on the planet. And the temperature there is so high that a healthy human with water and sitting in the shade will begin to experience heat disease within several hours. So by the time we reach 3 degrees C, and the trajectory suggests that we will reach there in the middle of the second half of the century, potentially 50 years from now, plus or minus. And it won't be like a light switch that we reach this temperature. It will be the slow onset of intolerable heat conditions. Those black areas will expand to represent 20% of the land surface. An area where about 1/3 of human population live. 1 out of every 3 people on this planet will be located under climate conditions intolerable for human existence. And of course, they're going to have to migrate. They're going to have to find new homelands. What will that look like? What are the political implications? What are the social and economic implications? And a few minutes, we will look at a modern day example of this and see that at least in the case of that example, the results are not good. So it's every place that you see this shading on this map, this horizontal shading will be these intolerable conditions. Water, fresh water, drinking water, and fresh water for agriculture of various types is in decline. In fact, there is a global freshwater crisis. The primary reservoir from which we pull our fresh water is the ground, and we are pulling in the continental US 17% more fresh water out of aquifers in the ground than nature can recharge or replenish every year. And this is a global pattern. In China, they withdraw 22% more water than is replaced every year by natural processes. This is the very definition of unsustainable living. India, it's over 50% over withdrawal of freshwater resources. And in North Africa and the Middle East, water is being withdrawn thousands of percent greater than nature can replace. And we are trending towards and experiencing already increased water demand. By mid-century, the demand for fresh water is expected to grow by 55%. We also have severe impacts to food. It turns out that the staples, the cereal staples of wheat, rice, soy, and corn, when grown in an atmosphere of higher CO2, and I don't mean extreme levels of CO2, I mean levels of CO2 that we have today in the air, are less nutritious. These cereals can have up to 13% less protein. It's replaced by carbohydrates and reductions in key nutrients like zinc, vitamin B complex, and iron. Let's look at wheat as an example. Today, global wheat provides 20% of all human protein, yet the yield of wheat is threatened by drought, flood, and higher carbon dioxide content in the atmosphere. By mid-century, the demand for wheat is projected to increase 60%, but the actual yield of wheat is projected to decline by 15%. This is a recipe for food shortages, and the declining nutrition alone is projected to cause an additional 300 million people to be malnourished by mid-century, and about 1.4 billion women and children to have anemia or iron deficiency, which can be very debilitating. So water shortages, food shortages, these can lead to violent conflict. And Syria is an example that has played out in the last decade. So this paper came out in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. It discusses the worst drought in a millennia in Syria, which caused widespread crop failure and mass migration of farming families into urban centers of Syria. There, these families found a lack of government services. Aleppo, Homs, Damascus, and other urban areas in Syria were found to not provide sufficient medical services, employment, reliable food, water, electricity. And the young men in these families formed a rebel force, started a civil war. The United States was pushing Al-Qaeda out of Afghanistan and Iraq at the same time. Certain sections of Al-Qaeda found safe haven in the political turmoil of Syria, and a vicious and cruel and violent conflict zone developed. Under these conditions, most people want to leave. We saw an exodus of over 4 million people from Syria. Those who traveled to the south were joined by folks from other regions of North Africa, where the same drought, which by the way has been attributed, climate change has been attributed to increasing the likelihood of this drought by 70%. Attempting to get to the European Union, smugglers would take these migrants across the Mediterranean Sea, or those who traveled north through Turkey across the Aegean Sea. Very often, these travelers were put into overloaded boats that were unseaworthy. Some of these were taken out to the 3-mile international limit, and the outboard motors were removed by the smugglers, expecting these folks to be rescued by the coast guards of Italy, Spain, and France, and Greece. There were some horrible tragedies. There were mass drownings that took place. Families were shattered, and it was a scene of utter devastation. Folks that made it into the European Union flooded into the EU by millions because of international agreements among the members of the EU. The borders are very porous. At first, Germany took in over 1 million people in a very organized and productive manner, moved them into various community centers, towns and villages across the countryside. An analysis that came out earlier this summer shows that many of these folks have assimilated into German culture very successfully. Elsewhere, the assimilation was not so successful. Brexit has the withdrawal of the United Kingdom from the EU has its roots in the desire of the British to close their borders to the influx of humanity from this disaster. There was a backlash in many communities where already residents in local communities did not have sufficient services and employment. And then the influx of these migrants pushed the local communities into a boiling point. Out of this rose a class of politicians who would point to the immigrants as the reason for local residents' problems, why food was too expensive, why their jobs didn't pay them what they should be paid, or taking jobs from them. These folks are known as nationalists or populists. The other term is demagogues. That is pointing to a group that is different than their voter base and leveraging that alienation in order to be elected to high office. In most cases, the rise of these authoritarian political figures failed, but we saw the election of Sebastian Kurz, who campaigned on the need for tougher immigration controls, quickly deporting asylum seekers, and outlawing the practice of Islam. The United States, we elected a demagogue as well, and a significant part of his platform was the closing of the southern border between the US and Mexico. There are studies that show that the migrants coming up from Central America into Mexico and wanting to cross into the United States, many of them were displaced from their homelands because of localized climate change, especially in farming communities that experienced drought. And so all of this, taking you back, was instigated by a 1,000-year drought in Syria, displacing farming communities. And the US military has taken note of this instability, which is caused and is becoming in the US military a major aspect of their readiness and their planning. Let's look at this short video, which is associated with the movie, which is available on Netflix.
We built society on this assumption of climate stability, and that stability is changing. All these things we take for granted, they're not just givens anymore.
The just released report from the Pentagon, climate change and the challenges it's creating for the military. The latest report says global warming is driving weather to new levels of extremes.
99% of my intelligence told me there's an ambush waiting for me. I would get to say, yeah, that there's that 1% that says there's no ambush, so the hell with the other 99%.
As a member of the United States military and 30 plus years of service in uniform, climate change is what we call an accelerant to instability.
If you have an area that is already unstable and then has the additional challenge of water shortages or food shortages or a disaster that makes people move, then you can start seeing conflict situations.
Syria's deadly conflict, a full-blown civil war.
If we look around the world today, we can already see conflict and climate in play right under the headlines that we're reading.
The new study finds climate change exacerbated the worst drought ever in modern Syria as a consequence of human interference.
Fragile social systems just need one more shock to tip them over the edge into social breakdown, into war.
Failure to think about how climate change might impact our globally interconnected system is a failure of imagination.
The flip side of the climate threat is the energy and resilience opportunity.
As a soldier, we're always looking to have an edge on the future. We can pay now, pay later.
All right, so there is this complex human socioeconomic sequence of events that plays out when you do get extreme weather events affecting the stability of our socioeconomic system. But there is also the confluence, the convergence of human overpopulation of the planet and our inappropriate manner of the use and extraction of natural resources. By deforestation, by pollution, and also by changes taking place in the ocean, the natural world of this planet has been plunged into a biodiversity crisis. So we know that the oceans are hotter because they have absorbed heat from the warming atmosphere. This is making the oceans stratified. The shallow waters of the oceans are becoming more stable, which is a bad thing. Stratification is basically putting a lid or a roof on the ocean water column, preventing or slowing vertical circulation. The primary sources of dissolved oxygen in the ocean are both from the atmosphere and also from phytoplankton that engage in photosynthesis in shallow waters. And if that dissolved oxygen in the shallow water is not allowed to be circulated into deeper portions of the water column, then you get anoxia, you get a decline in dissolved oxygen taking place because of this stratification of the ocean. And we already see a 2% decline in dissolved oxygen over the last 70 years. We also know that the surface temperature of the ocean is increasing, an average of 0.8 degrees C globally. This ocean warming and ocean acidification creates unstable conditions for coral. The coral polyp is an animal that has a symbiotic algae that lives in its cells, which is critical for its metabolism and for its food sources. And under these unstable acidification and warming conditions, coral will eject, or the symbiotic algae will leave the coral polyp, This is known as bleaching because the algae are what give color to the coral. And this does not kill the coral immediately, but eventually will. Bleaching so far has been occurring as an event, a seasonal event. Then it ends, the water cools off with the seasons or with the end of a marine heat wave, and coral recovers somewhat. But it's been modeled by a number of different research groups that just within the next 30 years, we're looking at most of or all of the world's coral reefs experiencing annual bleaching. And this is intolerable. We're basically looking at the end of the world's coral reefs sometime in the next couple of decades. And as reefs die, you see invasive algae come in, large, noxious algae. And unfortunately, human activities, such as overfishing the reef and also polluting the water in coastal zones, works against the success of the natural coral ecosystem and works in favor of these invasive species that prevent any potential recovery of coral reefs from taking place. And so because the corals are dying, their ability to continuously secrete the hard calcite and aragonite that makes up the reef itself, we see a new phenomenon called reef collapse, where waves will now exceed, the pounding of waves will exceed the ability of the coral organisms to continuously rebuild the reef, and instead reefs are collapsing. As reefs collapse, it means that the water near the shoreline gets deeper. That lets in more wave energy close to the coast, and we see an acceleration of erosion, coastal erosion taking place. So we also see tremendous changes on land. So again, climate change amplifies the negative effects of poor human resource practices. So one might point to overpopulation of the planet as one of these factors. But the truth is, we could, at our current population, live sustainably on this planet. However, we must greatly reduce our personal consumption habits, and we have to stop the pollution that takes place, as well as the destruction of biodiversity. So everything in red or pink here has been highly modified by humanity. And in green is wilderness. And you'll notice that the Sahara Desert and the Saudi area, and also the tundra of the north, these are the last wildernesses. And the high plateau, the Tibetan Plateau, and the Amazon, and fragments of the Congo Basin. So the remaining wilderness are stark areas that we would not consider very lush, biodiverse ecosystems, unfortunately. 58% of Earth's land surface is under intense human pressure. And just since the turn of this century, the last 2 decades, an area of ecologically intact land, the size of Mexico, has been lost. Mostly this took place in savanna grasslands and rainforests. And only 25% of terrestrial Earth can still be considered wilderness. Much of this is taking place because of our agriculture practices. In the last 50 years, food crop production has increased 300%, and half of all agriculture expansion has come at the expense of forests. We've destroyed an area the size of Africa to grow animals for eating. We're deforesting the planet at the rate of 30 football pitches per minute, largely to raise cattle and the grain to feed them. And the background image here is a soy field cutting into the Amazon rainforest. This soy will go to feed beef, cattle, that are used to provide steak and hamburgers for a growing desire for beef around the planet. 43% of all ice and desert-free land, 2/3 of all freshwater use is for food production. Over 80% of farmland is used for raising livestock, and it produces just 18% of food calories and 37% of protein. Cattle and the grain they eat use 1/3 of the available land surface on this planet. 16% of all available fresh water. 1/3 of worldwide grain production goes to feed cows. Producing beef generates 100 times more greenhouse gas than producing plant-based food. And we're using monocrops of hybrid corn to do much of this feeding. They are maintained, they are grown under conditions of heavy synthetic pesticide use and nutrients, most of which runs off the fields into the surrounding watersheds and into the coastal zone, leading to incredible ecological damage. And we engage in deep plowing, turning over the soil to drying, to be swept away by rain, and to oxidize the carbon in the soil so that it becomes CO2 and is released to the atmosphere. So climate change amplifies the problem of overpopulation and resource extraction. We've altered 70% of the world's lands with mines, roads, industrial farms, cities, and airports. 40% of the world's original forests have been eliminated. Per capita consumption has increased 45%. That is the amount of stuff, largely in westernized nations, largely in the United States and the EU, has increased by 45%, the amount of stuff we need as individuals. The extraction of living materials from nature has grown 200%. GDP has grown 300%. This is all since 1970. Global trade has grown by 900%. And 2/3 of all humans today face a water shortage for at least 1 month every year. Over 33 million people were displaced from their homes last year, and climate change played a role in 70% of these cases. And women from underdeveloped countries are 14 times more likely to die from a climate-fueled disaster than men, because they are the caretakers, they stay behind, they help the young, the ill, and the elderly. And yet plans for disaster management are largely excluding women. They're made by men who really don't understand the experience that these women have during an extreme weather event. Of all mammals on Earth, by weight, 96% are humans and cows. Only 4% of mammals are wild. Of all birds, 70% are chickens and other poultry, raised under factory farming conditions, and only 30% are wild. This paper came out in 2019. It states that the world is increasingly managed by humanity to maximize the flow of material contributions from nature to keep up with rising demands for food, energy, timber, and more, with global trade increasing the geographic separation between supply of these natural materials and where they are used. This unparalleled appropriation of nature is causing the fabric of life on which humanity depends to fray and unravel. Scientists are publishing papers with extraordinary titles: Sixth Mass Extinction, Biological Annihilation. Has land use pushed terrestrial biodiversity beyond a planetary boundary? A state shift in Earth's biosphere, depopulating the fauna of the oceans, animal loss, and pervasive human-driven decline of life on Earth. This paper has over 15,000 co-authors, all of them scientists. It is a warning, and it states that humans have pushed Earth's ecosystems to their breaking point and are well on the way to ruining the planet. This abuse of our planet has now pushed us into an era of pandemics. 70% of emerging diseases, Ebola, Zika, Nipah encephalitis, and almost all known pandemics such as influenza, HIV, and COVID are zoonoses, which means that they are transferred from animal populations to humans. Microbes carried by animal reservoirs that spill over to humans through contact with wildlife and livestock. The emergence of these diseases is driven by habitat loss, agriculture practices, climate change, and extreme events. It's estimated that between 600 and 800,000 yet to be discovered viruses are thought to still exist in nature with the ability to infect humans. Pathogen reservoirs with pandemic potential include bats, rodents, primates, water birds, livestock. And the pandemic risk is increasing rapidly with more than 5 new diseases emerging every year, any one of which has the potential to spread and become a pandemic. Pandemic risk is driven by exponentially increasing human impacts on the environment, driving biodiversity loss and climate change, land use change, agricultural expansion and intensification, wildlife trade and consumption, extreme weather events. All of these bring humans and wild ecosystems into contact where they have not been in contact previously. This leads to these spillover events, and the pandemic spread across the planet through roadworks, urban centers, global travel and trade. The exponential rise of consumption and global GDP has led to these emerging diseases from biodiverse developing countries who are forced to sell their resources to developed nations who are outsourcing their need for these resources. It's a modern form of colonialism. Climate change role in human pathogen convergence is widespread. The vectors that carry these pathogens, such as ticks, mosquitoes, fleas, and snails, are expanding because of climate change, expanding their zone. And the movement of people, animals, and vectors due to the disruption that is caused by extreme events is leading to increased disease transmission. For instance, dengue fever has increased 30-fold in the last 50 years related just to rising heat in the atmosphere. Habitat loss by deforestation, factory farming, where you have an endless supply of living animals in a closed environment so that a virus or even bacteria can evolve into more and more virulent forms. They can afford to kill their hosts because those hosts are replaced by new living hosts. Pandemic risk can be lowered by reducing meat consumption, reducing consumption of wildlife and wildlife-derived products, and conserving high biodiversity areas. How soon can we stop global warming? The Paris Agreement involved every nation on Earth, very few of which have actually adhered to their promises because the Paris Agreement is non-binding and there are no enforcement mechanisms. The agreement was to stop warming before it reached 2 degrees C, which, by the way, will be a devastating temperature when we reach it, and to pursue efforts to end warming before 1.5 degrees C, 1.5 to stay alive. But the truth is, renewable energy is not replacing fossil fuels. It's simply helping to meet the demand for new energy. And here from 2019, you see the rise of the fossil fuels is faster than the rise of renewable energy. And nearly a dozen global energy economists have projected continuing emissions towards mid-century when the pathway for emissions needs to follow the green arrow. Even COVID is not considered a robust reaction to global warming, despite the fact that 2019 may have been peak emissions, and emissions are projected to drop someplace between 7 and 10% for the year 2020. But this drop in emissions is not due to structural changes in the global energy system. It is due to a crisis and a recession from which all governments today are trying desperately to reemerge. And what we see is that at least one projection here from Bloomberg NEF, they project a recovery of the global recession by 2027, after which emissions are projected to decline an average of 0.7% per year. This is actually a trajectory towards over 3 degrees C of warming. To stop warming at 1.5, emissions must fall off a cliff. Emissions have to drop at least 10% per year. And if we're going to stop emissions at 2 degrees, then there's an additional 15 years of latitude. But whatever influence we have on our nation's governments, we absolutely must not allow 2 degrees to become a target. Even 1.5 is an extremely deadly temperature, as you've seen, already affecting many human populations on the planet. And there's the pathway to emissions for 2 degrees C. What many people don't realize is that cutting emissions and the end of emissions has to be accompanied by removing carbon dioxide from the air for many centuries. That will get the temperature back down. So our current pathway among the various model pathways is shown in red there. Okay, so let's wrap this up. What are the solutions? We know how to solve this crisis. Our global trends are rising CO2. The pandemic has not been shown to change that. Stated energy policies also are not leading to declining emissions. We need to follow a pathway of strongly declining emissions. We can do this through increasing the efficiency of our motors and buildings and appliances and transport, by exploding the use of renewables in every human community, and by getting away from the internal combustion engine, and by changing our personal behavior. There are social tipping points. Removing fossil fuel subsidies and incentivizing renewable energy in strong, meaningful ways. Revealing the morally harmful nature of fossil fuels. Building carbon neutral cities. Divesting from fossil fuel backed bonds and stocks. Strengthening climate education and engagement, and including carbon footprints in our purchases, and pricing the true cost of carbon. We need to think about our choices, avoiding plastics, avoiding carbon intensive shipping and aviation, moving strongly to electric vehicles and renewable energy, eating locally grown vegetable-based diets, staying informed with daily climate news, such as from Carbon Brief, the Daily Climate, and Inside Climate News, changing extractive agriculture to regenerative agriculture, and breaking this linear relationship between global GDP and atmospheric release of carbon dioxide. This form of extractive capitalism needs to change. And let's end with this short video which talks about capitalism as a cancer on this planet.
Every human being grows. We grow through childhood, and then when we hit adulthood, we reach a plateau. Our body has a regulating system which stops growth beyond a certain point. Occasionally, that system breaks down and a cell begins to multiply and to grow without regulation. And we call that cancer. Cancer is basically infinite growth within a finite living system, which is the human body. That is exactly what is happening with capitalism. Capitalism is dependent on infinite growth within a finite living system, which is the planet. Capitalism is the planet's cancer. And just like cancer in the human body, we have to cut it out. All through my adult life, I've been railing against corporate capitalism and consumer capitalism and crony capitalism, and these are the real problems. And it's taken a long time for the penny to drop. Maybe the problem isn't the kind of capitalism, maybe the problem is capitalism. So let's look at the planetary disaster. We're losing the soil, we're losing the fresh water, we're losing the insects, we're losing all the other astonishing species that we share this planet with. We're losing the coral reefs, we're losing the rainforests, we're losing everything. And it's all going at a phenomenal rate. What's causing this? The driving force is economic growth. A global economy growing at 3% a year doubles every 24 years, and then it doubles again. And then it doubles again. That's the trajectory we're supposed to be on. That's what governments want, where it just keeps doubling and doubling and doubling and doubling, which would be just fine if the planet was growing at the same rate. But we live on a finite planet. And infinite growth on a finite planet is a recipe for catastrophe. The only way it's been done so far is to use ever-increasing areas of the world as places we effectively steal from, where the most powerful parts of the world extract materials and cheap labor from the weaker parts of the world. And then ever greater parts of the world have to be used as a dump, to dump our waste, until basically the whole world is an extraction zone and a dump. The whole atmosphere is a dump for carbon dioxide. Our cities are a dump for air pollution. Our land is a dump for all the junk that we use for a day or two and then get bored of and pass on, which you have to do if economic growth is going to continue. If you've got enough money, you can buy a piece of land. You can buy the right to pollute the atmosphere with your private plane. You can buy a bluefin tuna steak, despite the fact that you're driving a species into extinction. You can buy mahogany furniture, whose extraction is causing massive destruction in the Amazon. Money translates into a right to natural wealth. Why? What's the just principle? There isn't one. And yet that unjust assumption is at the heart of capitalism. And those who are able to accumulate or inherit or grab enough money can then use that money to grab a huge chunk of our common treasury, our common resources, the stuff we all depend on to survive. And then they act like they have a natural right to do whatever they want with that. If everyone tried to live like the very rich today, we would need multiple planets, 5 planets, 10 planets, 100 planets, but we've only got one. But if instead you say, let's have luxury, but make it public luxury. Let's have fantastic public swimming pools, brilliant public parks, great tennis courts, great art collections, great museums, great community centres, great youth centres, great playgrounds, all those wonderful things that we try to accumulate for ourselves, but let's do it publicly. Then in creating that space, you don't take space away from other people, you create space for other people. You don't need to multiply those resources again and again and again as everyone tries to do it privately. By doing it publicly, you need far fewer resources. You can have a really rich, fulfilling life with very high standards of human well-being, but without the environmental destruction. And in so doing, we create community, where community has been smashed apart by capitalism. I don't think there's another way we're going to get through this century. If we carry on believing that people who are rich today can live like the oligarchs and people who are poor today can live like the rich, and everyone can just expand and expand and expand and accumulate, which is what capitalism tells us to do, and that we can just keep on multiplying GDP and we can double economic activity every 24 years like we're doing at the moment, then the only possible outcome is catastrophe. We need a whole new economic system. Double Down has been achieving extraordinary things, reaching millions.
All right, thank you. I know I've gone right up against the hour.
Yeah, thank
And
you, Chip. That was amazingly comprehensive and alarming. It's really, I think, yeah, just I don't know, just a core part of this course, I think, to confront ourselves with these truths and you know, strive to understand them, to internalize them, and to move forward from them. So there are some great things coming through in the chat. Lots of thanks and appreciation for you for pulling this all together. And I think what I'm just going to say to the fellows is if you want to just post some questions or follow-up thoughts in a thread that I'll create in our Slack, I can pass along questions to Chip to answer and go back and forth a little bit in writing over email. So we can definitely keep a lot of these questions and comments going and part of our cohort conversation. So, and there was a lot of stuff coming in about capitalism. So I think we're going to have to take that last video clip that you shared and maybe either rewatch that or have a whole nother discussion in a fireside chat about capitalism, growth and degrowth. And yeah, that's coming up as some more themes in the
maybe it's more like how capitalism is practiced, right? I see some of these comments that capitalism itself is not inconsistent with sustainability, but it's not being practiced in that way. And so we do need a whole new economic model.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and I appreciate everyone's comments in the chat and everyone's just responsiveness to this presentation. And yeah, we have a lot more ground to cover in this course. And Chip is a great friend of Tara. He's just been such an ally and an asset in providing this climate education and understanding. So I'll just end with a big thank you, and we'll keep some questions coming your way. Thanks again.
Yeah, thanks everybody. Sorry I used up all the time.
Oh yeah, no problem. Super informative. I'm just gonna save the chat and stop the recording.
Can you stay open for a couple of minutes? I want to cruise down through the chat and see some of the.
Yeah, definitely. I'll keep it all open. And if anyone has anything that they just want to throw out there, if you have a couple more minutes, I'll stay on as well.
Yeah, if anybody has any questions, I have another 10 minutes or so. Happy to have a discussion.
Cool.
That military documentary. Oh, I'm blanking on the name.
Oh, The Age of Consequences? Is that
right? Age of Consequences. Do not watch it alone. I end up in a pile of tears. I'm an emotional mess after watching that. So don't watch it alone. Have a comfort friend there for you.
Yeah,
it's
at least a pet intense. Or a human being.
There's another documentary about agriculture that Woody Harrelson produced called Kiss the Ground, I think.
Yeah.
That's on Netflix also.
I watched that recently, and I think we're going to try and either have our own Q&A with the film organizers or join in one of their monthly Q&As that they're hosting in December. Because I think that's,
Someone has mentioned Chasing Coral. Several of my friends are in Chasing Coral. And there's also Social Media, a Netflix documentary, which talks about how we're all clickbait, right? When you go into Google or whatever your search engine is, the algorithms detect what your preferences are. And, multiple times of doing searches, you're eventually presented with options for your search that feed into your biases, that feed into your natural biases. And this is the movie Social Media interviews the former heads of Facebook, Pinterest, and other media conglomerates. And there must be a half a dozen of them that are interviewed, and every single one of them does not allow their kids any screen time at all, does not allow it. And the former head of monetization for Facebook and for Pinterest was asked, where do you see this bias feeding tendency of search engines leading us? And he didn't skip a beat when he said civil war, right? Civil war, because, and we see this polarization in the United States, at least, of political factions, as people are continuously fed information that confirms their biases. It's just amazing. The loss of skepticism, I think, is one way we ought to characterize the modern age. Yes,
there's a question here towards the end. Oh, go ahead.
I'll send you the slides, Lanny, so you can make them available.
Thank you. Yeah, that would be great. They're full of information.
Someone said they're getting a little depressed. Actually, last year, Nature magazine came out with an article that there's now an official psychosis called environmental grief. It strikes climate scientists first, and it is caused by the realization of what I've tried to communicate to you today. So I'm sorry if I'm putting you into a state of environmental grief. I can tell you that I've been through it and I've come out the other side and I've found happiness again. So while I might have depressed you, find happy things, you can come out the other side and still be an aware and informed person about these problems. All right. Yeah, lots of great comments. So if anybody has any questions?
Yeah, feel free to unmute yourself. There's been, yeah, some mixed into the chat somewhere.
Okay. So Lanny,
oh,
go ahead. Go ahead.
Oh, yeah, I was just curious then, what it is that what is it that helped you, you know, come out of that eco grief? It's a more personal question, but I think it's a helpful one.
Well, I actually started to embrace the beauty of wearing my emotions very close to the surface. Maybe I've been suppressing them, which is a problem a lot of men deal with. But I really appreciate now the beauty around me much more than I did previously. So it sensitized me, which is a good thing. I also live with my family. I'm very, very lucky. I have my family, my adult grown kids and their children all with us here in the same house. So I have a tremendous support network. And I think I am by nature a happy person, an optimistic person, mixed with pragmatism and realism. And at the same time, I became a vegan, which didn't quite work all the way for me. So I've decayed back into vegetarianism and electrified as much of our life as we can afford to. And, you know, talking about climate change helps a lot. And I think it was just, I didn't go into eco grief burdened with an already existing state of depression as part of my natural makeup. So it could be very problematic for someone who already has some emotional baggage, which many, many people do.
Thank you so much for sharing.
Yeah, you're welcome.
I have a question. So
Yeah.
when you think from a solutions perspective, so one obvious solution is that you find better climate friendly alternatives, which are, you know, better in convenience and price to people so that they shift to those alternatives and reduce their emissions. Other way could be to, you know, fight it policy wise, that we start taxing lesser to climate friendly alternatives, say e-bikes or, you know, electric cars. So can you think of any other solutions to this? You mentioned that capitalism is cancer, but I feel that it's very impractical to ask people to reduce their emissions. Like when you coming from a solutions perspective, like not all people will adopt this given like the majority of the crowd.
So here in Hawaii, we are a small group of islands. We're very lucky in that sense, in that we can make significant changes fairly directly, and we're on the verge of implementing a carbon tax. And so a carbon tax, or recognizing the true cost of carbon to society, and putting that cost into purchases that are carbon intensive, and then that extra cost goes into a common wealth, and you can return that to everybody in the form of a check, in the form of income. This is tax and dividend. You could keep part of the carbon tax for public works of various types, or you could just return it to everybody. So basically, those who are living high carbon lifestyles are providing a new source of income for those who are living low carbon lifestyles. So that's the idea behind a carbon tax. We in the United States are doing this already with cigarettes. Cigarettes caused are one of the reasons why we have a huge rise in the cost of medical costs. The tax on cigarettes, at least in Hawaii, is going into our medical school to train more doctors and also to reduce the cost of getting medical treatment in Hawaii. So this idea of a tax on activities that are bad for society came from a Cambridge economist named Pigot. So it's called a Pigovian tax, and it's very common. So that's just one thing. Another is to change your personal behavior. Another is to push hard for changes in agriculture practices. I think regenerative agriculture has the potential to store carbon while we grow food at the same time. Yeah. You got another comment?
Yeah. So you mentioned four things. One is the carbon tax there in Hawaii. So like my follow-up question is how to implement that in countries like US, India, or China. Like, and the second thing is you mentioned cigarettes being taxed more and that money being used to medical institutions. But even when you talk about countries like US, India, and China, the cigarette consumption has anyway increased. So how to practically come up with practical solutions
Then
for a large crowd?
You sue the hell out of the companies that are promulgating these drugs, the drugs of oil and natural gas and coal. You take these folks to court. And by the way, I think that the lawyers of the world and the law schools of the world ought to visit every nation that does not have in place laws that would allow suing oil companies, and should work with those governments to create a set of laws. And then lawsuits should be filed around the planet, and the filing should take place in the same 24-hour period. As the sun passes overhead, every nation underneath the sun should be filing a lawsuit against every oil company in the world. And in one day, the whole planet can sue these bastards because of what they're doing to us. So any lawyers out there, this idea is yours.
We have one. I don't know if she's still in here. Hemavathi, we'll have to pass this on to her.
Yash,
yeah.
Went off on a tangent there, but did I get any, what didn't I answer? What other question do you have?
So every time your talk was really inspiring. It was very, very informative and concise. But every time I listen to a new fact about climate change, I just think about how do I really solve this practically? So I'm living in a country like India, which is a developing country. How do I practically come up with solutions? You're mentioning examples of Hawaii, but think about countries which are, giving the most of the emissions and the conditions.
it can be hard to feel like you can do anything. I feel that way. So the first thing is to change your personal life. Change your personal life to, as much as you can, live what you're talking about. And then secondly, do what you're doing right now. Become informed. Become well-informed. Read. Every day, feed yourself with the news. Like create scientific information as your daily feed. And then talk to other people. And I promise you, pretty soon, you will want to attempt the unthinkable, which is to give a public talk yourself, right? Humans' greatest fear is public speaking, but try it sometime. And then reach out to whoever is your local elected official, and open up a relationship, open up a conversation with them or their workers, and consider running for office yourself. And when we get out of the pandemic, take the opportunity to fly to some of these global meetings, fly to the next COP, the next UN COP, which is in Glasgow, England. Just go there. You may not be able to get in, but just absorb it and see what's going on and talk to people as they come in and out, and just inform yourself, and you will become empowered. You will become empowered.
We have one more question that maybe we could end with from Kelsey. Kelsey, do you want to ask your question? And thanks for those great questions, Yash. Those were just exactly what we're tackling in this course.
Sure. Thank you, Chip. This was a really great talk. So I'm a graduate student in oceanography, so I'm in academia, and something that I think I really struggle with is there's, I guess, maybe almost a few clashing cultures on like what role scientists should play in helping to communicate the crisis. So I know a lot who feel like if you communicate too much, you can be seen as an advocate, which will compromise your objectivity. And yeah, I was, curious just your thoughts about this, especially because I feel like it's changing, at least in my generation.
So you look familiar. Are you in Hawaii, Kelsey?
No, I'm not. I'm at Oregon State, but I used to sail a lot out of Hawaii with Sea Education Association. So I know a lot of people at UH.
Yeah. You might know my former grad student whose name is escaping me right now. She was head of science education for the Sea Institute.
Mary Ingalls.
Yeah, Mary, she got her master's with me. Yeah.
Okay, great. Yes, I know Mary very well.
Sorry, everybody. So Kelsey, yeah, academia has a very smothering approach to attempting to extend your science out to the world. I'm an associate dean at an oceanographic school here at University of Hawaii. And I'm amazed at the dozens of my colleagues who are real experts in climate change who will not get out of the ivory tower. And at first I was afraid that I was doing something that would be frowned upon, but then I decided, the hell with them and their opinions. I truly came to understand that our planet is at risk. My children's future is at risk. And so I don't care what other people think. And once you become informed to this level, those binders and suppressions on your activity, they should evaporate, and you should stop caring about that. Because as you've seen today, what I've tried to communicate is that it really is an emergency. It's a crisis. So just don't worry about them, Kelsey.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, I'll keep mining through the chat and keep track of these resources that people have shared and any last lingering questions, and just send them over to Chip. But I think that's a great ending point, and I love that reminder that the more informed you get, the more empowered and able to take effective action we are all becoming. So yeah, thank you guys for your continued engagement and questions, and I'll be sure to send this recording, the slides, and the chat around to all of us.
All right, everybody. Bye-bye.